So in this video, I want to go over 5 mistakes real estate investors make. One of the first mistakes I see real estate investors make, not understanding the real estate market. I always preach this is when you're a beginner real estate investor, you're looking at a piece of real estate to invest in. If it's like fix or flip, buy and hold, multifamily building, whatever it is, you need to understand the market, right? You need to understand the location that you're actually buying. If you're buying it in a different city that you live in, I would recommend researching that city. If it's in a different province, if it's in a different state, it doesn't matter. You need to understand where you're buying the real estate. If you're buying a real estate in a certain city that you don't live in, I strongly recommend to do the research to understand the good locations, the bad locations, to understand if there's like lots of immigration going into that province, flowing through that city, if there's job growth, if there's employment growth. These are factors that if you take some time to research, you would actually pick a city in the right direction of growth, which actually will help you create better returns on your investment. The other side of this is if you don't do the research, you can invest into a city that has no growth, is stagnant, or if anything, is on a downward trajectory. What happens then is you could buy a property for 200 grand. 2-3 years later, it's only worth 150. And you could have prevented this by doing the necessary research before you invested into that city. So the second mistake I see investors make is buying in the wrong location. So similar to not understanding the real estate market, buying in the wrong location is very important to understand. It's just because once you've chosen a city to invest in, within that city there are good areas and bad areas. And you want to understand the good areas versus the bad areas because you could buy a property even though the city itself is on an upward trajectory in terms of employment growth, rents growth, job growth, immigration's going in. It doesn't necessarily mean everywhere in that city is a good place to invest. There are going to be low-end areas within that city that will have way more crime, way more drugs, right? Way more violence, right? So it's just you want to avoid those areas. You want to invest in either A or B locations. A are usually very high-end areas. And then B is usually average, right? Like between affordable, but kind of upscale. The goal would be to find an asset that's obviously undervalued in one of those great locations. And one of the benefits of actually investing in a good location is once you're done the project, you'll easily be able to increase rents rather than if you invest in a bad location where there's probably high crime. What will happen is no one's going to want to live there. So increasing rents is going to be difficult, which depending on your strategy, you obviously need to increase rents to increase the value. So the third mistake I see investors make would be over leveraging. I've talked about this before. I also made this mistake when I was younger. The problem with over leveraging is, let's just say for example, you bought a property in a good location and it's worth about 500,000. You have a mortgage of 400 grand and now you want to do some updates to it, whatever. You get a second mortgage, maybe 100,000, maybe 85, whatever. Let's just say 100,000 just for this example. So what that would mean is you are basically 100% leverage for that property. You had a first mortgage for 400,000, you have a second mortgage for 100,000. So, and the property is worth only 500. So that property is 100% leveraged. The issue with this is if the market takes a turn and the market goes up and down over the years. If you bought that property in a high market, whereas yes, it was worth 500,000, but then 2, 3, 4 years later, that property is now worth maybe 350, 400 because we're in a down market, prices are stabilizing out, you are over leveraged now because you owe 500,000, but the property is only worth 400. So you don't ever want to be in a situation like this. And also in a scenario like this is usually what happens when you over leverage, your expenses go up, right? So usually when your expenses go up, you always want to factor in if you still cash flow, because if you don't cash flow, you're technically in a negative cash flow situation where your asset is no longer considered an asset, which is technically considered a liability. Remember, an asset is something that makes you money. Usually every month, every year, income coming in. A liability is something that takes money away from you. Of course, you could write it out and then maybe it'll stabilize. You always want to keep that concept in mind. Is it bringing me money in every month or is it taking money away from me? And I guess the last point about over leveraging, which could happen, is if you over leverage too much and then you create a negative cash flow situation, you could go bankrupt, right? You could lose everything. So obviously that's something you want to avoid. The fourth mistake would be not implementing systems. Again, I have made this mistake when I was just beginning in real estate. I did a lot of this stuff myself. I thought I could handle it. Started growing, buying more property. And then what I noticed is it was a lot of work. I tried to hire other people, tried to kind of outsource things, but I also wanted to keep a lot of control in-house. And I really avoided hiring a third-party property manager or hiring the right people. So the issues of this is I was overwhelmed all the time. So since I wasn't able to get to all the inquiries in a timely manner, some of the tenants were complaining because obviously the quality of service was going down. Because as a landlord, your tenants are your customers. Once I kind of realized the issue, I then obviously outsourced third-party property management. And it was obviously daunting at first, but I kind of revamped my portfolio to go bigger. Once I started to get into the kind of the bigger multifamily, it obviously made sense with management, with systems in place. I wouldn't have never been able to grow without that. There's no way I could have managed like even 50 to 100 units on my own. That's not possible. So that's one thing that not implementing systems will create, right? It will create slow growth. You will hardly be able to grow. So once you implement systems, and systems can be hiring a third-party property manager, hiring employees. If you already have employees, better systems would be implementing property management software. Things that can obviously streamline the process to make it easier to get the job done. So when you implement better systems, it's easier to get things done. And usually when you get things done, you won't lose as much money anymore. And the last mistake I see investors make would be not having enough cash reserves. And this is crucial. Cash reserves are so important. Why? Because it helps you sleep at night, honestly. Because the truth is, in any kind of business venture, there is an element of risk and there are things that you can't control. So having those reserves are basically like a safety net just in case, the unforeseen happens. And, one of the benefits of having lots of reserves is when there's a great opportunity, right, that maybe comes your way and you need to kind of capitalize on it very quickly, you have the ability to, right? One thing that you always have to keep in mind though is you don't want to keep doing more and more deals and, minimizing your cash reserves. The point of cash reserves are having cash there in emergency situations. And a great example would be in the market we're currently in. Because of the high interest rate market, mortgages have increased. So that means the overall expenses have probably increased for everybody. So having the appropriate reserves in situations like this, you'll be in a better position to ride the storm once interest rates go down. So these 5 mistakes are crucial, especially when you're a beginner real estate investor. Hopefully you learn from others and don't make the same mistakes. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll make similar content in the future.